She did not scream. She did not run. When 600 pounds of black muscle and blind fury came barreling down that frozen Montana street, Verity Sloane planted her feet in the mud, spread her arms wide and stood her ground while every man in Stone Creek Bend dove for cover. The horse was called Black Verdict. He had broken bones. He had ended careers. He had made grown wranglers weep into their hats and swear before God they would never sit a saddle again. He had killed a man once in a round pen up in Billings, and the men who told that story told it in low voices, the way you speak of a thing you do not fully understand. And now he stopped trembling, snorting his great wet breath, clouding the cold air inches from her chest. If you have ever been told you were too much and not enough at the very same time, if you have ever walked into a room and felt every eye in it measure you and find you wanting before you ever opened your mouth, then this story is for you. Stay with me to the end, because what this woman does in the snow before it is over is something no man in that town would ever forget, and neither will you. The stagecoach from Billings arrived 40 minutes late, and the whole town of Stone Creek Bend knew it before the wheels had stopped rolling. They always knew. Word moved faster than horses in a town that small. And the word that afternoon passed from the telegraph office to the feed store to the saloon in less time than it took a man to finish his coffee was that Ransom Calder's mail-order bride had finally come. And she was fat. That was the word they used. Not stout, not full-figured, not a woman of generous proportions the way a polite man might write it in a careful letter. Fat. The stagecoach driver had stopped at a relay station 2 hours east, and by the time he had helped her down from the coach and back up again, half the riders who passed him on the road had already carried the news ahead like fire, chasing dry grass across a summer field. So when the coach finally rolled to a stop in front of the general store, there was already a crowd gathered in the cold. Not a welcoming crowd. The kind of crowd a town assembles when it expects to be entertained and has come early to be sure of a good view. Verity Sloane felt them before she saw them. She felt the weight of their attention through the thin plank walls of the coach, the way you feel a cold draft before the door has fully opened. She had felt that kind of attention her whole life. Her whole life had been built beneath it, shaped by it, worn smooth in some places and rubbed raw in others by the constant grinding pressure of being looked at and found insufficient. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress. Dark blue wool, practical, the best she owned. The hem was caked with mud from the relay stop, and there was a small tear near the left sleeve where a door latch had caught it somewhere across 3 territories of bad road. She had nothing to replace it with. This was the dress she had arrived in, and it would have to be enough, because she was 32 years old, and she was finally completely done pretending she could be something she wasn't for the comfort of strangers. She gathered her traveling bag. She picked up the small bundle of dried lavender she had carried all the way from her mother's garden in Ohio. Her one indulgence, her one piece of home. She tucked it into her coat pocket where her thumb could find it in the dark. And then she pushed open the coach door and stepped out into Montana. The cold hit her like a fist. January in Stone Creek Bend was not the polite winter she had known back east. It was a hostile, personal thing. The kind of cold that hunts out the gaps in your coat and settles into your lungs like it means to stay the whole season. She breathed it in. She held it. She steadied herself on the iron step, and then she climbed down into the mud. She heard the laughter before both feet had touched the ground. It started low, the way laughter always starts when it is trying to disguise itself as something else. A cough, a murmur behind a glove, and then a boy couldn't have been more than 12 standing near the post rail with 3 friends said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Lord Almighty, Calder sent away for a whole woman, didn't he? The laughter spread like spilled water, finding every low place in the floor. Verity stood in the street and let it come. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only fed it, that looking away only gave people permission to go further. So she stood there with her bag in her hand, and her spine as straight as she could hold it, and she looked directly at the boy who had spoken. And she waited. He stopped laughing first. Good, she thought. A man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, wide through the shoulders. hands scarred by years of work, a jaw that looked carved from the same grey stone as the mountains standing behind the town. He held his hat in both hands, and his eyes moved over her once, just once, with an expression she could not quite read. Not cruelty, not welcome either. Something careful, something held back behind a door he was not yet ready to open. "Mrs. Sloane," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Steady, like a man who chose his words the way other men chose their tools, for purpose, not for decoration. "Mr. Calder," she answered. She had practiced his name in the coach. She had practiced the whole conversation the way she always did when she was walking into something that frightened her. She had imagined a dozen versions of this meeting. A kind man. A cold man. A man who looked at her once and immediately regretted every letter they had ever exchanged. A man who would be polite about his disappointment in that specific careful way that is somehow worse than open cruelty because it leaves you nothing honest to push against. What she had not imagined was the way his eyes stayed on her face. Not on her body. Not on the mud at her hem or the tear at her sleeve. On her face, as though her face were the thing he had come to meet and the rest of her was simply weather around it. "You had a long ride," he said. "I did. You hungry? I could eat." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Good. My cook's been nervous about impressing you all week. I'd hate for the effort to go to waste." She did not know what to do with that. She nodded. He reached for her bag. She held it a half-second longer than necessary. Old habit. Old lesson. Don't let people take what is yours because they do not always give it back. And then she let him take it. "My wagon's at the rail," he said, turning toward the hitching post. "We'll get your trunk loaded and—" The screaming started before he finished the sentence. Not human screaming. The high, tearing sound of a horse in pure terror and fury. A sound that is less animal than it is some force of nature given a throat to come out of the kind that reaches inside your chest and closes a fist around your heart. At the far end of the street, the stock pen, a reinforced enclosure of heavy timber and iron bolts that Verity had barely registered when she stepped down off the coach, exploded outward like it had been built of paper and matchsticks. Black. That was all she saw at first. A wall of black moving faster than anything that size had any right to move, mane like smoke torn loose in a gale, eyes white-rimmed and rolling, hooves throwing frozen mud in great sheets as the animal hit the open street at a full ground-eating gallop. The crowd scattered like startled birds. Men dove behind barrels, behind wagons, behind one another. Women snatched up their children and pressed back into doorways. The boy who had laughed at Verity hit the ground flat on his belly and covered his head with both arms. Ransom Calder spun and shouted something, a name, maybe, or a command. But the horse was not listening. It was not capable of listening. Whatever was inside that animal in that moment was not thought or training or response to any voice on earth. It was pure, undiluted terror dressed up as rage and given 4 hooves to run on. And then Verity saw the child, a little girl, 4 years old, maybe 5. She had been standing near the water trough with a rag doll tucked under one arm, and in the chaos of the crowd scattering, she had been left behind, forgotten in the simple animal arithmetic of grown people saving themselves. She stood frozen in the middle of the street, staring at the black thing thundering toward her with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of someone far too young to understand that she was about to die. Verity Sloane was not fast. She had never been fast. Her body had always moved the way it moved, with effort, with weight, with a deliberateness that required more intention than most people ever gave to the simple act of crossing a room. She could not sprint. She could not throw herself across that street in 2 long strides the way a lighter woman might have. But she was already moving. She dropped her bag in the mud. Her hand found a flour sack that had been knocked from a cart, in the panic 50 pounds at least, white with dust, and she grabbed it by the neck and walked straight down the center of that frozen street, toward the horse, toward the child. "Verity!" Calder's voice sharp and close behind her. "Get back!" She did not get back. Later, she would never be able to fully explain what she did next, because there was no technique to it, no system she had learned from a book or a teacher or a kindly old hand. It was something older than technique, something she had spent her entire life learning without ever once knowing she was being taught. She put herself between the child and the horse. She planted her feet wide, solid, the way she had learned to stand when she did not intend to be moved. And she let the flour sack fall from her hands into the mud at her feet. And she dropped her eyes not down, not the way you lower your eyes in surrender, in defeat, in the particular shrinking that the whole world had spent 32 years trying to teach her, but soft and sideways, the way her grandmother had once told her that a frightened animal understands. Not a challenge, not a surrender, just present, just here, just one more creature standing in the cold, who meant no harm to anyone living. The horse was 30 feet away when she did it. 20. 10. She heard the crowd behind her make a sound she could not name. Not screaming exactly, more like the sound of a great many people who have all stopped breathing at the very same instant. She did not look up. The horse stopped, not gradually, not slowing over distance the way a controlled animal slows under a steady hand. He stopped the way a wave stops against a cliff, haunches dropping all 4 hooves, gouging long furrows in the frozen mud. The whole massive momentum of him rolling forward and breaking over her like wind, like heat, like the pressure of something enormous, choosing at the very last possible second not to destroy. She felt his breath on her face before she heard him. Hot, ragged, trembling. She smelled him sweat and fear and something wilder underneath something that had never been fully tamed and perhaps never would be. His nose hung 6 inches from her forehead. She still did not look up. Easy, she said. Quiet, no louder than she would have spoken to a frightened child in the dark. Easy. Nobody's going to hurt you. His breathing was enormous. It shook through the whole street like a second heartbeat laid over the first. Easy, she said again. And then she reached behind her without looking, and her hand found the little girl's shoulder. And she walked the child backward 3 steps, 4, until she felt another pair of hands. A woman's hands, desperate and shaking, taking the child away. Only then did she step back herself. 1 step, 2, slow. The horse stood in the middle of the street and watched her go. Stone Creek Bend was silent. Not the silence of a crowd holding its breath that has a pressurized quality to it, a sense of something about to burst its seams. This was a different silence. The silence of people who had expected one thing and been handed something else entirely and had not yet found the language for what they had just seen with their own eyes. Ransom Calder had stopped 6 feet behind her. She could feel him there without turning around. That, said a man's voice from somewhere in the crowd, rough and uncertain, was either the bravest thing I ever saw or the dumbest. Hush, Walter, snapped a woman sharp as a slap across cold cheeks. Verity turned around. Calder was looking at her. His hat was still in his hand from when he had taken it off to greet her, and he had not put it back on, and the wind was moving his hair, and he did not seem to notice. And there was something in his face she did not know what to do with. It was not the look she had gotten from men her whole life, the assessment, the measuring the visible arithmetic of being found insufficient and dismissed. And it was not pity either. She had gotten very, very good at recognizing pity over the years. It was something closer to recognition. Like he had looked at her and seen something he had been quietly wondering about for a long time. That horse, she said before he could speak. What's his name? Calder blinked. Black Verdict. Who named him that? I did, a year ago when we brought him in from a cavalry auction. A pause. He'd already killed a man by then. Seemed fitting. What did they do to him? She asked. Before you got him. Something shifted in his expression. What makes you so sure anyone did anything to him? Because a mean horse doesn't look like that, she said. A mean horse has dead eyes, flat, empty. That horse has terrified eyes. There is a difference, Mr. Calder. And once you've learned to tell them apart, you can't ever stop seeing it. Nobody said anything. The horse in the street behind her let out a long, shuddering breath and dropped his head toward the frozen ground as though the standing itself had exhausted him. Calder put his hat back on. "Let's get you some food," he said. "We'll talk about Black Verdict later." "I'd like that." "The food or the talking?" "Both," she said. He almost smiled again. She was already beginning to suspect that was the most a man like him would ever give away at one time. And she found to her own quiet surprise that she did not mind it. The Calder Ranch sat 4 miles outside of town, and the wagon ride out was the quiet kind that shared silences sometimes are. Not uncomfortable exactly, just full of things that had not been said yet, and both of them knowing it, and neither of them in any particular hurry to begin. The mountains went violet and white in the failing afternoon light. The road was frozen solid under the wheels, and every rut and stone of it came up through the bench and into her bones. Verity sat beside Ransom Calder with her bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap. And she thought about how exactly she had come to be here on this bench in this cold, beside this stranger. The letter had taken 6 weeks to reach her in Ohio. Ransom Calder. Widower. Rancher. Montana Territory. Looking for a capable woman, it had said. Not a pretty one. Not a young one. A capable one. Those were the words that had made her sit down at her kitchen table and read the letter 3 separate times. Because in 32 years of living, no man had ever once described her as capable in an advertisement for a wife. Pretty was what men advertised for. Young, cheerful, pleasing. Capable was a word for a hired girl, for a workhorse, for a thing you used. And it had landed in her chest like the first warm thing she had felt in years, because capable was the one word in the whole language that she knew beyond any doubt was true of her. She had been married at 19 to a man named Thomas Mercer, who had been kind to her for approximately 4 months, and unkind to her for the 8 years that followed. Not violent, she would always say that when she thought about it, as though it were a bar worth clearing. Not violent, but relentless. Relentless in his disappointment. Relentless in his small daily corrections. Relentless in the particular cruelty of a man who had wanted one kind of wife and received another, and could never quite bring himself to forgive her for the difference between the two. Thomas had died of influenza 2 winters back. She had grieved him the way you grieve a thing that has been quietly damaging you for years, with a complicated tangle of sorrow and relief that she suspected would never fully come undone, not if she lived to be 100. She had been alone since then. And capable. That much she knew. "How many hands do you run?" she asked. Calder glanced at her. 8, 9 in the summer. "You know cattle. My father ran a farm before this. I didn't grow up soft. I didn't figure you did." A pause. The wheels groaned over the frozen ruts. "Your letters. You said you nursed your husband through 2 winters of sickness. He was ill often. I learned what to do for a fever, for a wound that wouldn't close, for a cough that turned into something worse. That's useful." He kept his eyes on the road. "We're a long way from a doctor out here. Last winter we lost 2 calves and very nearly lost a man to a fever because nobody on the place knew enough to bring it down." He paused. "I'm not looking for an ornament, Mrs. Sloane. I told you that in the letter." "You did." "I meant it." "I know you did," she said, and looked back at the road ahead. "That's why I came." The ranch came into view as the last of the light drained out of the western sky. A cluster of low buildings around a central yard, firelight warm in the windows of the main house. Smoke already rising from the cook's chimney, promising something hot against the cold. It was not a grand ranch. It was a working ranch. She could see the difference, and she found she respected it more than she would have respected the other. But what she also saw, set apart from everything else with a barrier of thick timber posts standing between it and the rest of the world, was the corral. Even from this distance, in this failing light, she could hear the horse inside it. Pacing, the slow, heavy, endless pacing of an animal that has never once in its life felt safe enough to stand still. "He's been like that since we brought him in," Calder said, following her gaze. Won't settle. Can't be ridden. Can barely be approached without somebody getting hurt. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and set the brake. The men want me to put him down. Most of them. And you don't? He was quiet for a moment. I paid $400 for him at that auction, he said. I'd like to get something back for it. She looked at him. Is that the only reason? Another pause. Longer this time. Long enough that she watched his hands tighten on the brake lever and then loosen again. No, he said. That's not the only reason. He did not explain it, and she did not push, but she filed it away the way she filed away everything that mattered, and she understood even then, sitting in the cold dark with the smell of wood smoke and a stranger's silence between them, that there was a great deal more to this fair, careful man's stubbornness about a killer horse than $400 and a rancher's pride. She would learn the rest of it in time. She would learn that the horse had been the very last thing his wife Ellen ever bought before the sickness took her. That Ellen had stood at that same auction rail 3 years gone now and pointed at the wild black colt and said, "That one has a heart in him somewhere, Ransom. I can see it from here." And that Calder had bid on the animal as much for the dead woman's certainty as for anything the horse himself had ever shown a living soul. That every time he looked at Black Verdict pacing in the dark, he was not looking at $400. He was looking at the last thing his wife had ever believed in. And he could not put a bullet in that, not yet. Not while there was any chance at all that she had been right, but that was later. For now there was only the cold and the firelight and the sound of pacing in the dark and a woman who had crossed 3 territories to a man who had asked for capable and gotten more than he bargained for. Inside the main house, the cook, a small nervous man named Obadiah, who moved about his kitchen as though he expected to be criticized at any moment and frequently had been, had laid out a meal that was clearly his very best effort. Salt pork, boiled potatoes, cornbread golden at the edges, a jar of honey, and a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon up in. Verity sat down and broke off a piece of the cornbread and ate it and let out a long, genuine breath. "This is good," she said. "Really good. Is that buttermilk in it?" Obadiah blinked at her. "Yes, ma'am. My mother's way of doing it." "It's the right way. Tell her so, if you ever get the chance." Obadiah's face did something complicated and overwhelmed, and then he turned quickly back to the stove so that she could not see the rest of it. But she had seen enough. She had seen a man who had spent a long time being thanked for nothing, hear himself thanked for something. She knew that look. She had worn it herself. She was halfway through the meal when the door opened and the ranch hands came in. There were 6 of them that evening, and she felt the change in the room the moment they crossed the threshold. The drop in temperature that had nothing at all to do with the cold they brought in on their coats and their boots. They filed in quietly. Too quietly, with the deliberate silence of men who are being careful, which she had learned over the long years to distrust far more than she distrusted noise. A noisy man tells you where he stands. A quiet one is deciding. They took their seats. They helped themselves to the food. Not one of them introduced himself to her. It was a man at the far end of the table who finally spoke. Big through the shoulders, with a nose that had been broken at least twice and a jaw that suggested he had usually been the one doing the breaking. He ate without looking up, and when he spoke down at his own plate. "Heard you made quite an entrance in town." Verity set down her fork. "I stepped off a stagecoach, that's all." He looked up then. His eyes were flat and assessing, and not the slightest bit friendly. "Way I heard it, you stepped in front of Black Verdict." "I did." "Fool thing to do." He let it sit there in the warm room, then he said it again slower, as though she had failed to grasp it the first time. "Fool thing to do." "Magnus." Calder's voice, quiet and final from the head of the table. The big man held her gaze one moment longer, then dropped his eyes back to his plate and went on eating as though nothing had passed between them at all. Magnus Thorne. She filed the name away, because you always filed away the names of the people who meant to make your life difficult. The rest of the dinner passed in a silence broken only by the scrape of forks and the settling of the fire. She did not sleep well that first night. She had not expected to. The room Calder had given her was small and clean, with a quilt on the bed that had clearly been made by someone who loved the person they were making it for. Intricate, careful, the stitches small and even and patient. Ellen's work, she suspected, though no one had said so, and she did not ask. She lay beneath it in the dark and listened to the wind coming down off the mountains and to the distant, restless sound of Black Verdict pacing in his corral. And she thought about the way Magnus Thorne's flat eyes had found her across the table. She had seen that look before. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant, "You do not belong here, and I intend to be the one who proves it." She had spent her whole life being told in one way or another that she did not belong. In her marriage, in her own mother's parlor, in every room she had ever walked into where a thin woman had been expected and she had arrived instead. She had been told it so many times and in so many different ways that some mornings the very first thing she felt before she was even fully awake, before she had opened her eyes onto the new day, was the familiar settling weight of not being enough. But she was here. She had gotten on that stagecoach. She had ridden 6 days across 3 territories with a tear in her sleeve and mud on her hem, and almost no money left in her purse. And she had stood in the middle of that frozen street when every other soul in town ran for cover, and the horse had stopped. She pressed her fingers to the lavender in her coat pocket, where the coat hung on the bedpost in the dark. In the corral, Black Verdict paced. She had told Calder the horse was afraid, not mean. She believed that with her whole heart. She believed that fear could be carved so deep into a living thing that it began over the years to look like aggression from the outside, and that most people, seeing only the aggression, never once stopped to ask what lay buried underneath it. Never once wondered what had been done to make a creature like that. She believed it because she knew it. Not about horses, about herself. In the morning she rose before the sun. She dressed in her warmest things, layer over layer. She did not ask anyone's permission. She walked out across the frozen yard in the grey pre-dawn dark, her breath making small ghosts in the still air. And she stopped 10 feet from the corral, and she leaned against a post, and she said nothing at all. The horse was at the far end of the enclosure. He had heard her coming. She knew he had the way. His head came up sharp, and his whole body went rigid as a drawn bowstring, but he did not charge the fence. She counted that as encouraging. "I'm not here to do anything," she said to the dark and the horse and the empty morning. "I'm not going to come in. I'm not going to touch you. I just wanted to be near something that understands what it feels like." Black Verdict shifted his weight. He did not come closer, but he did not retreat to the very back of the corral either. She pulled the lavender from her pocket and held it out on her open palm toward the rail. Not reaching, not pushing it at him, just offering the way you offer something to a creature that does not trust you, yet knowing they may not take it today or tomorrow or for a very long stretch of cold mornings. Holding out your hand anyway, because that in the end is what it means to mean it. She heard boots crunching on the frozen ground behind her. "You're up early." Calder. She did not turn around. "I always have been." He came up beside her and looked at the horse, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. Their breath rose together in the cold. "He was a cavalry mount," Calder said finally. "Taken wild off the range as a colt, trained hard, used harder. When the army was finished with him, they sold him at auction to a man up in Billings who figured he could break what the army couldn't. Put him in a round pen and went at him with rope and whip for 2 days straight, no rest, no water." His voice stayed even but not unaffected. "The horse came out of that pen a different animal than the one that went in. The man who bought him died under those hooves a week later." Verity's hand tightened around the lavender. "And you bought him after all that?" "I did." A pause. "I saw him at the auction and I thought there was something still worth saving in him. Something they hadn't reached, something they couldn't reach no matter how hard they went at it." He shook his head slowly. "Maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe that's just a thing a man tells himself." "You weren't wrong," she said. He looked at her. "The thing they couldn't reach," she said. "That's not a flaw in him, Mr. Calder. That's the only reason he's still standing here at all. That's his survival. Whatever they did to him, there was one small room down inside him that they never got the door open on, and he has been guarding that door with everything he has ever since. She turned her head and met his eyes. You don't fix that kind of damage by going harder at the door. You fix it, if it can be fixed at all, by going slower than feels possible. By standing outside it day after day and proving that your hand on the latch doesn't mean pain. It might mean nothing at all. It might just mean somebody's there. He was quiet for a long moment. The first gold was coming up over the mountains now. I reckon that's the most words you've said to me at one time. I reckon it is. He looked back at the horse. What do you want to do? I want to stand out here in the mornings, she said, before the men are up and about. I won't go in. I won't reach for him. I'll just be a thing he can predict in a life where nothing has ever been predictable except pain. She slipped the lavender back into her pocket. Right now, what's the alternative? You put him down, and maybe that day comes, but it doesn't have to come today. Calder pressed his mouth into a hard line. Magnus thinks it ought to come today. Mr. Thorne, she said carefully, thinks a great many things. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, a short exhale through the nose gone almost before it arrived. He settled his hat lower against the cold and turned back toward the house. Breakfast is at 6, Mrs. Sloane. She stayed at the fence a while longer. The sky was lightening over the mountains, now going from black to gray to that first thin cutting edge of gold. Black verdict had not come a single step closer, but he was watching her. She could see the dark, wet gleam of his eye from clear across the corral, steady and weary, and underneath the weariness, something she could only call tired. Bone-tired. The tiredness of a thing that has spent every hour of every day for years braced against the next blow. She knew that tiredness. She had carried it her whole life. The bone-deep exhaustion of defending yourself against a world that has already decided before you so much as open your mouth what you are and what you are worth, and is only waiting for you to confirm it. I'll be back tomorrow, she told him, and the day after that, and the day after that one. The horse's ear turned just slightly toward the sound of her voice in the cold. She took it as a beginning. But beginnings she knew better than most were the easy part. She had been on the Calder ranch one single day, and already she had counted the men who would stand against her and named the one who would lead them. She had seen the corral and the whip-shy way the great black horse flinched back from any quick movement near the rail. She had seen the careful, guarded thing in Ransom Calder's eyes that he was not yet ready to name aloud even to himself. And somewhere out past the firelight in a house she had not yet learned to think of as home, a great wounded animal paced in the dark and waited to find out whether this woman, the one they had all already decided was too much, would turn out to be the first creature in his whole hard life who actually meant what she said. She intended to find out the very same thing about herself. By the end of her first week on the Calder ranch, Verity Sloane had taken the full measure of the place the way she took the measure of everything quietly, completely, and without telling a single soul what she had found. The root cellar needed reorganizing, or they would lose a third of the winter stores to rot long before the thaw. Obadiah the cook had a real gift for baking that no one had ever once encouraged him to use, so he hid it behind salt pork and apology. 3 of the ranch hands were watchful but not unkind, willing to be won over by a fair day's proof. 2 were simply indifferent riding for the brand, and nothing more. And 1 Magnus Thorne was waiting for her to fail. She could feel his waiting the way an old farmer feels weather coming on in his joints. The particular quality of the attention he paid her was not the attention of a man who disliked her as a person. He did not know her well enough for that, and would not let himself. It was the attention of a man who disliked what she represented. A test he had not asked to be handed. A challenge to an order he had spent 15 years building and 4 years running. He had been Calder's headman for those 4 years. She learned it from a young wrangler named Eli Garrow, who was 17 and gap-toothed and possessed of the entirely charming inability to keep a secret for longer than about 20 minutes. "Magnus runs this place, ma'am," Eli told her on the 3rd day while she was sorting the cellar, and he had been sent over with the inventory ledger. "Mr. Calder owns it, but Magnus runs it, if you understand the difference between the two." "I understand the difference, Eli. and he doesn't think I belong here." The boy studied his own boots. "He says ranch work ain't. He says a woman like you ain't built for it. Them's about his words." "And what do you think?" The boy looked up genuinely startled to have been asked his opinion by an adult. He considered the question with the unpolished seriousness of someone who had not yet learned that opinions were supposed to be kept to oneself or kept strategic. "I think you stood in front of Black Verdict and didn't die," he said slowly. "So you already done a thing Magnus can't say he done. Seems to me that ought to count for something." She smiled at that. "Go put the ledger on the table. I'll get to it after the noon meal." Each morning before the sun came up, she walked to the corral. She never brought anything dramatic. No apples, no sugar, no rope, no clever scheme dreamed up in the dark of her room. Just herself leaning on the post, quiet and present in the killing cold. She talked sometimes about Ohio, about her mother's garden in summer, about the way the winter light fell different here in Montana than anywhere she had ever been. Sharper, cleaner, like it was trying to cut something loose. By the 5th morning, Black Verdict had moved to the near end of the corral. Not close, not anywhere near close enough to touch, but closer than the far rail. And his eyes, when they found her in the gray light, held something they had not held before. Not yet. Trust was a thing earned across far more than 5 cold mornings, and she would not insult either of them by calling it that. But the thing that comes before trust. The first faint loosening of the iron certainty that this too was a thing to be feared. She told no one. Some things you keep because the telling of them too soon can break them. On the 7th morning, she found the whip. It was tucked behind a post at the back corner of the corral. A short-handled driving whip, the kind used for hard work in a round pen. It had not been there the morning before. She stood and looked at it for a long, long moment. Then she bent and picked it up and turned it over in her gloved hands. And she lifted her eyes to the horse. Black Verdict was pressed into the far corner of the enclosure. His breathing was fast and shallow. His eyes were white-rimmed and rolling, and there across the black of his winter coat she could see them thin parallel marks, raw and fresh, where someone had laid a lash across his flank in the dark before dawn. The fury that moved through her then was cold and quiet and complete. She had felt anger like this before. The specific purifying rage of watching something that cannot defend itself be hurt by someone who knew better and chose it anyway. She had felt it across a kitchen table in Ohio years ago, listening to Thomas Mercer speak to her in the low, patient voice he used when he wanted to make her smaller than she was. She had felt it in 100 rooms and doorways where she had been treated as an imposition on the world. She knew exactly what it tasted like sitting at the back of her throat. She set the whip down against the fence post very carefully so it would make no sound. She did not want the horse to hear it fall and learn to dread the sound of it again. "I see it," she said softly. "I see what they did to you in the night." Black Verdict trembled in his corner. "They don't get to keep doing it," she said. "Not while I'm standing here. I give you my word on that." She stood at that fence for the full hour she had allotted, and she did not move, and she did not look away, and she did not let him see the rage. By the end of it, the horse had come 6 inches closer to her end of the corral. 6 inches. After someone had spent the night undoing a whole week of her patient work with a lash, she thought about the patience this was going to require of her. She thought about how much easier it was in this world to destroy a thing than to build it. How a man could tear down in a single hour what it had taken another soul a week of frozen mornings to raise. She thought about Magnus Thorne and his flat, measuring eyes across the supper table. Then she went inside and made the coffee and started in on the winter inventory and said nothing to anyone at all. But she did not forget, and she did not stop going to the corral. She found the whip again on the 9th morning. Same post. Same exact position, as though whoever had left it there wanted her to understand beyond any doubt that it was deliberate. A message left for her to read. This time, Black Verdict stood in the far corner with his head hung low and his sides heaving the way a horse breathes when it has been run hard or frightened hard in the recent dark. And this time she did not stand for an hour. This time she picked up the whip and she carried it back across the yard to the main house, and she walked into the warm kitchen where Obadiah was building up the breakfast fire in the iron stove. She opened the door of the stove, and she fed the whip into the flames piece by piece until there was nothing left of it but a curl of black smoke and a smell of burning leather. Obadiah watched the whole thing without one word. When she was done, she poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot already warming on the back of the stove, and she sat down at the table. "You didn't see that," she told him. Obadiah went back to stirring his oats. "See what, ma'am?" Good man, she thought. She was still at the table, both hands wrapped around her cup, when Magnus Thorne came in. He moved through the kitchen the way he always did, like a man who had decided long ago that the space belonged to him by right and had never once been corrected on the matter. He poured his coffee without looking at her. He sat down at his end of the table, unfolded his napkin, and said to nobody in particular, and the room in general, "Horse got worked up again last night. One of the younger hands must have got too close to the corral after supper." He said it the way men say the things they want you to react to, flat, sideways, eyes on his own plate, so that if your reaction went wrong, he could always claim with a clean face that he had not been speaking to you at all. Verity ate her oatmeal. "You hear me, Mrs. Sloane? I heard you, Mr. Thorne. Just letting you know your little project got set back some. Pity, all that standing around in the cold." She set down her spoon. She looked at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who has sat across tables from difficult men for 32 years and has learned at real cost exactly which battles are worth fighting out loud and which are better fought in patient silence. "Thank you for the update," she said. His eyes narrowed. He had expected something else. An argument, maybe. A flush of anger, a wobble of distress he could use. He did not know what to do with a calm he could not crack. Calder came in from outside, stamping the mud from his boots in the doorway, and looked between the two of them. He had the instinct of a man who has spent years reading the temperature of bunkhouses and barns full of people who did not much care for one another, and the temperature in this kitchen registered on him at once. He pulled out his chair and sat down without a word about it. "Magnus," he said, "I need you on the north fence line this morning. Snow took down a section past the creek. I was going to work Black Verdict today." The table went still. Verity did not look up from her bowl. "The fence comes first," Calder said. "Level, even, leaving no purchase for argument, a pause, the kind that has real weight to it." "Yes, sir," Magnus said, flat, final. He pushed back from the table and rose, and on his way out, he passed close behind Verity's chair. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She felt the intention in his passing the way you feel a cold draft slip through a crack in a wall in the night. Not a blow, just a reminder that something outside was much colder than this warm room, and that it was patient, and that it was not done with her yet. Calder waited until the door had closed behind him. "Is there something I should know about?" he asked. "No," she said. He looked at her a long moment with the expression of a man who is 90% certain he is being lied to and has decided for reasons of his own to honor the lie for the time being. "All right," he said, and reached for the coffee. That afternoon, the first time she had gone out to the corral outside her settled morning routine. Black Verdict heard her coming, and she knew now the difference between the way he reacted to her footsteps and the way he reacted to anyone else's. For the men he went to the far end and dropped his head and braced his whole body, for what experience had taught him always came next. For her, he simply went still. Head up, ears swiveling forward, watching. It was not welcome. Not yet, but it was no longer bracing either. And the distance between those two things was the whole distance she had come to travel. "I know," she said quietly, holding her hands open and empty at her sides. "I know last night was bad. I'm sorry I wasn't here to stop it." The horse breathed. His great sides rose and fell. "It's not going to happen again," she said. "I can't promise you the whole world, Black Verdict. I can't promise you summers or green grass or a soft hand on every man who ever comes near you. But I can promise you that. No more lashes in the dark. Not while I draw breath on this place. She did not honestly know whether she could keep that promise. She said it anyway. Because some promises are worth the making, even when you cannot be certain you can keep them, because the making of them is in itself a kind of shelter you build over a frightened thing. She heard footsteps behind her on the frozen ground and did not turn. "He watches you different," said Eli's voice. "I know." The boy came up and rested his forearms on the top rail beside her, and for a moment he was quiet, which was rare enough that she noticed it. "Magnus is telling the men you've been coddling him, the horse, I mean. Says coddling a dangerous animal only makes it more dangerous, says you'll get somebody killed." "And what do the men say to that?" "Most of 'em nod along." A pause. "It's easier to nod along with Magnus than not to. But Pruitt, he's out with the cattle most days, you ain't hardly met him. Pruitt says he come past the corral this morning and saw the horse walk right up to the middle rail while you was standing there. Says in 2 months he never once saw Black Verdict do that for any living man." Eli shifted his weight from one boot to the other. "I just figured you ought to know that not everybody thinks like Magnus. Some of us are watching real close and we're keeping our own count." "Thank you, Eli." He nodded, embarrassed and pleased, and headed back toward the barn. And she stood at the fence and thought about what it meant to have an ally you had not asked for and had not earned through anything but plain stubbornness. The particular, unexpected warmth of being seen clearly by someone who did not have to look at all. That evening, Calder was waiting at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him and a mug of cold coffee at his elbow, and the look of a man who had been sitting there a while, working himself up to a conversation he did not relish. "Sit down, Mrs. Sloane." She sat. He turned the ledger around and pushed it across the worn table to her. "That's everything I've spent on Black Verdict. The auction price. The reinforced corral that timber cost dear, hauled in from 40 miles off. The tack I bought back when I still believed I'd ride him someday. The doctor's bill, after he put a wrangler through the rails and broke the man's arm in 2 places. He looked at her steadily across the lamplight. $462, all told. She looked down the column of careful figures. "All right. The men want me to cut my losses and be done. Magnus says it every single day, that every day that horse is on this property is another day somebody else's wife gets a telegram." He folded his scarred hands together on the table. "And he is not wrong about the danger of it. So, what I need to understand from you plainly is whether you are making real progress out there, or whether you have gone and gotten attached to a project that simply cannot be finished, no matter how many cold mornings you give it." She felt the question land in her chest. Not unkindly, Calder rarely did anything unkindly, which she had begun to understand was its own quiet kind of character, rarer out here than courage. But directly. And a direct question deserved a direct answer even when the answer cost something. "I can't give you a timeline," she said. "I won't. That's not how any of this works. And if I stood here and promised you one, I'd be lying straight to your face, and you'd know it, and you'd be right to." She laid her hands flat on the table. "What I can tell you is this. 3 days ago, that horse stayed pinned to the far rail when I came out at dawn. This morning, he walked to the middle of the corral and stood there while I talked to him. That is not attachment talking, Mr. Calder. That is progress measured in feet, in the only currency that animal has ever understood." He studied her face in the lamplight. "And if something goes wrong, if he comes through that fence one night and a man gets killed, then you put him down and the blame is mine, and I will carry it the rest of my days. I won't hand it to you." She held his gaze without flinching. "But I don't believe that is what's going to happen, because I don't believe that horse is the real danger on this ranch." She let a slow breath go. "I think somebody has been going into that corral in the dark and working him up with a whip. Twice this week. I think you've half suspected it yourself. And I think the reason you sent Magnus Thorne all the way out to the north fence this morning was not because of any snow." The silence between them stretched long and full, and neither of them looked away from it. "That's a serious thing to say about a man," Calder said quietly. "Yes, sir, it is. I don't say it lightly." He stood and carried his cold mug over to the stove and stood a moment with his back to her, looking down into the banked coals. "Magnus has been with me a long time," he said, "through hard winters and one near bankruptcy. He's the best hand I have ever employed, and I've employed a good many. He is not a cruel man by nature." "No," she said. "I don't believe he is either. He's a frightened man. There's a world of difference between the two even when they wear the same face." That turned him around. "He's frightened," she went on, "because he tried to break that horse with his own 2 hands and all his pride, and the horse broke something in him instead. Something he can't name and can't forgive. And now there is a woman standing at his corral every morning, doing by plain patience what he could not do by force in front of every man he commands. And that is a humiliation he simply does not know how to live inside of." She paused. "I have known men like Magnus Thorne my entire life. Not wicked men, wounded ones, men taking their old wounds out on anything smaller or weaker than themselves, because it's the only way they know to feel large again." She met his eyes. "That doesn't mean I'll stand by and let him hurt the horse. But it means I understand what I'm looking at. And it means I'd rather you didn't go at him hard. Not yet." Calder set his mug down slowly on the stovetop. He looked at her as though she had spoken a few sentences in a language he had not expected to hear out of her mouth. "Give me 2 more weeks," she said. "Let me show you something with that horse that even Magnus Thorne cannot argue away. Something he'll have to see with his own eyes and call a liar to deny." He thought about it. She could watch him weigh it. The $462, the Wrangler's broken arm, the 4-year-old habit of trusting Magnus Thorne's hard judgment against the one thing he had seen with his own eyes in the street in town. The woman who stood dead still while every other soul in Stone Creek Bend ran. 2 weeks, he said at last. She nodded. "Thank you." She was 3 steps from the kitchen door when he said her name. "Mrs. Sloane." She stopped, her hand on the latch. He was turning the empty mug slowly between his fingers, not looking up at her. "For whatever it's worth to you, I have never once had a hand man or woman stand in front of that horse the way you did in town that day. I've turned it over in my mind most every night since. I don't entirely understand it. I just thought you ought to know that it stayed with me." She did not know what to say to that. She was not used to being told that a thing she had done had mattered to anyone. She was used to being told it was reckless or foolish, or that she had simply been lucky and ought not to try her luck again. "Good night, Mr. Calder," she said. "Good night." The 11th day changed everything. She had been at the fence for the better part of 40 minutes. The cold sitting deep in the soles of her boots, her fingers stiff and clumsy around a mug of coffee, gone lukewarm when Black Verdict walked to the rail. Not charging, not pacing. Walking, the slow, deliberate, unhurried walk of an animal making a choice, with no one forcing his hoof. He stopped 2 feet from the posts directly in front of her and lowered his great head until his nose hung nearly level with the top rail. His breath came out in long clouds. She could count the scars on him from where she stood, the thick ridge along his neck, from an old rope burn, the striations across his near flank, the healed-over notch in his left ear that she had wondered about since the very first morning, and never would learn the cause of. She did not reach for him. She stood with her hands wrapped around her cup, and she let him look his fill at her, and she looked back. "Hello," she said. His ear turned toward her voice. She talked low and even. She told him about the first horse she had ever known, a great gentle gelding named Hector, who had belonged to her father back in Ohio, so steady and so kind that children still learning the reins could be set on his broad back without a moment's worry. She told him she had not sat a horse herself in 6 long years. She told him about the letter and reading it 3 times at her kitchen table because no man in all her life had ever once advertised for capable instead of pretty. "I don't know if any of this is going to work," she told him. "The horse, the ranch, the man." She stopped. "But I'm staying. Whatever else happens, I want you to know that much is settled. I am not the kind of woman who leaves when a thing gets hard. I learned a long time ago that leaving was a luxury that was never going to be offered to me, so I made my peace with staying, and staying is a thing I have gotten very, very good at. Black Verdict's nose crossed the top rail. Not far. An inch. 2. Just the tip of his great black nose clearing the rail and hanging in the cold air between them. She did not move. She breathed in and breathed out and held every single muscle in her body perfectly still, because she knew beyond any doubt that any movement now, any reach, any flash of eagerness that came from her own hunger rather than his readiness, would send him straight back to the far corner and cost her 3 days of mournings. She had learned that too, the way she had learned almost everything that mattered. By having it done to her wrong, first by someone who could not wait. His nose touched the back of her hand, cold and rough and impossibly real. She closed her eyes. 1 second. 2. Then he pulled back and turned and walked to the very center of the corral and stood there with his back to her the way a horse will when it is finished with a thing but has not yet decided how it feels about having done it. She opened her eyes. She looked down at the warm, damp print his breath had left on the back of her bare hand. She did not celebrate. She did not say a word. She picked up her empty mug and walked back across the yard to the house, and she felt something moving through her chest that was not quite joy and not quite relief, but lived somewhere in the narrow country between the two. The feeling of a door that has been locked a very long time, swinging open just far enough to let in a single thread of light. She told Calder that evening, not dramatically, not in triumph. She sat down across from him while he worked through the week's supply orders by lamplight, and she said, "He touched my hand this morning. Through the rail. I didn't reach for him. He came to me and he decided, and he touched my hand." Calder set down his pencil. For a moment he looked at her with something that was not quite disbelief, but was working its slow way past it. Then, "How many mornings have you been going out there?" 11. He picked the pencil up, set it down again. "Black Verdict has put 3 men in the dirt in 2 months. One of them can't fully close his left hand to this day." He looked out the black window at the dark yard. "And in 11 mornings, he came to you. He came to me." He was quiet a long while. Then he asked her a question that had nothing at all to do with the horse, about Thomas Mercer, about whether the man who had spent 8 years humiliating her had ever once known what she was truly capable of. And she told him the truth plainly, because she had been honest her whole life, even when honesty had cost her dearly, that her husband had decided what she was the week after they married, and had never bothered in all the years that followed to look again. Calder nodded slowly. And then he told her in fewer words than the moment deserved that his own dead wife Ellen had been the one who truly understood this ranch, not the cattle, not the land, those he knew himself, but the people. The way a crew worked together or came apart. The temperature of a room before anyone had spoken. And that in 3 years of being a widower, he had not had one single soul on the place who understood that. Until now. "Your scene," he said. He turned the pencil over in his fingers. "What you've been doing here, the cellar, the cook, the inventory, the horse. It hasn't gone unnoticed, not by me. I just thought you ought to know that too. 3 words. You are seen." She thought about how many years she had gone without ever once hearing them, and how much room they took up in her chest now that someone finally had. She slept better that night than she had slept in years. She was 15 days in when Magnus Thorne found out she had been burning his whips. She never learned exactly how. She suspected Obadiah not from any malice. The man had no malice anywhere in him, but because the cook had a settled habit of narrating his own kitchen to himself when he believed no one was within earshot. And the bunkhouse wall, she had come to learn, was a good deal thinner than anyone had ever troubled to measure. Magnus came to the corral in the early evening, cold enough to see his breath hang. Black Verdict stood at the near rail now, and there was something in the way his head came up at the sound of her step that had begun almost to look like anticipation. "You burned my equipment," Magnus said. She had known this was coming. She had had 15 days to ready herself for it. "I burned a whip," she said, "that someone left at this corral twice in a single week. Tucked behind the same post both times. I don't know whose it was. She turned and faced him squarely. Do you know whose it was, Mr. Thorne? He was bigger up close than he ever seemed across a supper table. Not taller, broader. The particular bulk of a man who has done hard physical labor his whole life and learned to use the sheer space his body occupies as a kind of standing argument. She had been standing up to men who used their bodies as arguments since she was 16 years old. She widened her stance in the frozen mud and met his eyes and did not give an inch. Tell me something, she said. How many times did you go into that corral with a whip in your fist? The muscle in his broken jaw worked. How many of those times did you walk back out safe? I walked out fine. Every time. You walked out, she said, because that horse chose in the last second not to kill you, not because you ever once controlled him, because he chose. She turned back to the rail. That choice, that small mercy he keeps finding somewhere down inside himself is the only thing standing between this ranch and a dead man. You beat that out of him and you don't get a controlled horse. You get a dead one, or you get a funeral. Silence but for the wind. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but it came out lower and rougher than he had meant it to. Maybe not, she said. But he touched my hand 4 days ago of his own free will, and he has never once touched yours in all your 15 years of knowing better than everybody. So one of us is doing something right out here in the cold, and one of us has been sneaking out in the dark to undo it with a piece of leather. She heard his breathing change. The sharp, held quality of a man who has been named accurately to his face and cannot stand it. You tell Calder, he said. It was not quite a question. I told Mr. Calder the horse made progress, she said. That is all I told him. Your name never came up. A long silence. Then, very low, Why? Why would you hold your tongue? She turned and looked at him then and chose in that moment not to give him the same soft sideways gaze she gave the horse, because he was a man and not a wounded animal, and a man deserves to be looked at straight. So she looked at him directly, plainly, the way you look at someone you have decided to tell the truth. Because you are afraid of that animal, she said. You've been afraid of him since the first day he came on to this place. And that fear curdled into cruelty the way it nearly always does in a man who would sooner die than admit to being afraid of anything under heaven. She paused. And because if I told Calder what you've done, you would lose your place here. And a man your age in this country with that on his name, you've got nothing else waiting. And that doesn't help the horse, and it surely doesn't help you. And I did not cross 3 territories to make a hard man's life harder than I found it. I came to fix what could be fixed. Magnus Thorne stood in the cold and looked at a woman he had written off entirely the moment she stepped down off that stagecoach. And she watched him hunt for some shape of what she had just said that he could be angry at, could push back against, could use. And she watched him fail to find one anywhere. You don't know the first thing about me, he said finally. I know you're good at your work, she said. I've watched you these 2 weeks. You're good at it, and you know every foot of this land, and you care about this place more than you'd ever say out loud. And a man who cares about a place doesn't generally go around hurting things just for the pleasure of hurting them. She paused. You were trying to fix something too in your own way. I understand that better than you would ever believe. You just had the wrong tools in your hands and nobody ever showed you any others. Black Verdict at the near rail was watching Magnus with the tight, focused stillness of an animal cataloging a known and remembered threat ears, pinned forward, nostrils flared wide, weight shifted back over his powerful hindquarters, ready. He'll never trust me, Magnus said, and the anger was gone from his voice, now clean, gone. What was left underneath it was older and rawer and harder for a proud man to carry. No, she said honestly. Probably not after what passed between you. She let that sit in the cold air. But that is not the same thing as useless. A man can be of great use on a ranch full of creatures that aren't that one horse. There is more to this place, Mr. Thorne, than the thing that beat you. He was quiet for a long time. Then without another word he turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse through the gathering dark. She stood at the fence and let her hands finally stop their shaking. They had been shaking since he first said her name, though she had not let him see one tremor of it, and now alone she breathed out everything she had been holding in. Black Verdict pushed his nose over the rail and bumped her shoulder. She startled. He startled. For one full second the two of them stood there in the dark, equally and completely surprised by the other. Then she lifted her hand slow and pressed her palm gently against the side of his enormous face, and he let her. And she stood there in the cold Montana evening with her bare hand laid against the cheek of the most dangerous horse in the whole territory, and she thought with a certainty that went down to her boots, This is the reason you came all this way. What she did not know was that Eli Garrow was standing 30 feet off in the deep shadow of the open barn door and had seen every bit of it. She did not know that by breakfast the next morning every man on the place would know not about the whips, not about the hard words she had traded with Magnus, but about the small, specific miracle of Black Verdict bumping his nose against her shoulder in the dark of his own free will. And she did not know that Magnus Thorne stood a long time in the bunkhouse doorway after she had gone inside, looking out across the yard at the corral, and that the thing written on his weathered face in that moment was not anger and was not contempt. From a distance in the last of the light, it looked a great deal like shame. But all of that was still the easy part, because 3 days later, the afternoon stage from Billings brought a letter addressed to Mrs. Verity Sloane in a cramped, familiar hand she had prayed she would never have to see again. And when she broke the seal and read it standing at the cold kitchen window, the chill that went straight through her had nothing whatsoever to do with the Montana winter. It was from Silas Mercer, her dead husband's younger brother. And it did not read like a letter from a grieving relation come to make peace. It read like the opening move of a man who had come a very long way to take something back, and who had the last line made plain already bought his ticket west. She read the letter twice, the way she had once read Calder's advertisement 3 times at her kitchen table back in Ohio, with the slow, deliberate care of a woman who has learned at hard cost never to react to words on a page until she understands exactly what they have been written to do to her. Silas Mercer, Thomas's brother, younger by 2 years, meaner by a full decade. A man who had been making quiet calculations about the farm she had been left with from the very moment Thomas was lowered into the cold Ohio ground. The letter was 3 paragraphs of poison dressed up in the clothes of grief and family duty. As Thomas's widow, it informed her she had abandoned her obligations to the Mercer estate when she fled the county. There were debts. Thomas's debts. She could not lawfully remarry until they were settled in full. And if she had already remarried, then the marriage was not valid in the eyes of the law. And any man fool enough to have taken her was harboring another man's property. But it was the last line that turned the cold in her chest to solid ice. I will not be settling this matter by post. I have business that brings me to Billings, and I expect to conclude all of it in person before the month is out. He was coming. She set the letter down on the windowsill and looked out at the white yard. And she understood with the clarity she always brought to things that meant to hurt her exactly what this was. Not a legal matter. A pressure tactic plain and old. Silas Mercer had not crossed 3 territories out of any concern for his dead brother's estate. He had come because she had left and had sold the only thing that was truly Thomas's, the farm, to fund the journey that had carried her clean out of his reach. And he meant to get something back. Money, or her, or the simple animal satisfaction of seeing the fat widow made small and frightened again. Calder found her at the window. He read the letter without being handed it over her shoulder, the way a man reads a thing whose nature he can already guess from the set of his wife's back. I'll write my lawyers tonight, he said. Lawrence Stone down in Billings. He'll have your brother-in-law understanding by week's end that this marriage is good and valid, that the debts are no concern of yours, and that if he wants to keep pressing the thing, he is welcome to ride out here and say so to my face in my yard. He's already coming, she said. It's in the last line. He doesn't mean to be answered by post. Calder went very still. He's not the kind of man who stops when he's told to stop, she said. I lived 2 doors down from him for 8 years. He stops when it costs him something he isn't willing to pay. Then we make sure it costs him something. She turned and looked at him, this fair, careful man, standing behind those plain words like he meant to plant his boots there and not be moved. And she felt the deep, unfamiliar solidity of having someone genuinely in her corner. Not because he was performing the role of a protector for an audience, but because he had looked square at the thing in front of them, made up his mind, and meant to keep it. "I'll write him myself," she said. "He is my problem out of my own life. I'll handle him with my own hand, but I would be grateful if your Mr. Stone sent his own letter at the same time, so that Silas understands for the first time in his life that this is not one lone woman he's leaning on. Not anymore." Calder looked at her a long moment. "That's reasonable." She wrote her letter that very night at the kitchen table by lamplight. 3 paragraphs of her own to answer his 3. It was not cruel, and it was not soft, and it left Silas Mercer no room at all to misunderstand a single word of it. She told him exactly what the farm had sold for. She told him exactly what Thomas's debts had truly amounted to, and precisely what the balance was between the 2 figures, a balance that did not favor his story. She told him she had counsel of her own now with copies of every paper. She told him any further word on the matter could be directed to that counsel. And she told him that she wished him well in the rest of his life and wanted no part of his presence in hers, now or ever. She sealed it, set it on the hall table beside Calder's letter to Lawrence Stone, and slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a woman who has finally stopped flinching at the mere sound of a name. The trouble when it came did not come from Billings. It came from the bunkhouse. It was the 2nd week of February now, and the Territory's ranches were holding the winter supply, gathering the half-day's ride into town to consolidate their orders, trade the season's news, settle their accounts before the worst of the weather closed the roads for good. It meant most of the Calder crew gone to Stone Creek Bend for the day, and it meant Verity walking back into the very same street that had laughed her off the stagecoach in January. She did it the way she did everything hard. She put on her best dress, the dark blue wool with the sleeves she had mended by lamplight her first week, and she stood up as straight as her spine would allow. And she went. The street had changed, not transformed, subtler than that. It was the difference between a room that is merely tolerating your presence and a room that has gone quiet and reconsidered it. The boy who had made the first joke the day she arrived was sitting on the feed store steps when the wagon rolled past, a little older around the eyes than 2 months ought to have made him. He looked at her. He did not say anything. He pulled off his hat. She very nearly stopped the wagon. She did not. She let it be exactly what it was. A small, unglamorous, enormously important moment of a person choosing differently than he had chosen before, and she drove on. A silver-haired woman with the upright posture of someone who had spent 4 decades refusing to apologize for the space she took up in the world, fell into step beside her at the general store. "You're Calder's wife, Cordelia Frost. My husband runs the spread 2 miles east of yours." She held the heavy door. "I heard what you did with that horse." "Word travels out here," Verity said, "faster than the horses themselves." Cordelia Frost looked her over with a frank, unhurried, measuring gaze, the look of one woman taking the true weight of another. "I also heard the town boys made a public spectacle of you the day you came in. I'm sorry for it. I was standing right here and I did nothing to stop it, and out here that's near enough the same as having done it myself." She let the door swing closed behind them, shutting out the cold. "Come to supper Sunday. My husband Walter is dull but harmless, and I find I could use the company of a woman who isn't the least bit afraid of her own opinions." "I'd like that," Verity said, and found to her own quiet surprise that she meant every word of it. She was loading the last of the supplies into the wagon bed, her mood lifted by a margin she had not expected when she heard the horse scream. She knew that sound. She had heard it once before in this exact street in January, and it had lived in her memory ever since as a single specific frequency, a note she could have picked out of any chaos on earth. The sound of black verdict in pure terror. Her blood went to ice. She ran. She ran the way she ran, with effort, with weight, with every ounce of will she had in her, and already beneath the screaming she could hear the other sounds layering up. Men shouting over one another. Something heavy striking the frozen ground hard. a splintering crack that meant a rail had given way. She came around the corner of the livery, where the stock had been penned for the gathering, and she crossed the open distance without slowing. Magnus Thorne was on the ground. He was alive. She could hear it, the ragged-winded whooping sound of a man who has been thrown and has not yet got his air back into his lungs. But he was on the ground inside the pen, and Black Verdict was above him. All four hooves churning the frozen mud, the horse circling his eyes white-rimmed and rolling his great head swinging, and a rope trailing loose from one of the man's outflung hands like a written confession. Someone had put a rope in Magnus Thorne's hand. She would learn the rest of it later in pieces. That Magnus had been in the saloon since mid-morning, that a drink or 3 or 4 had loosened the old shame in him until it ached like a rotten tooth, and that a man at the bar had goaded him, said the new woman out at Calder's had made him soft, said he used to be the hand who could break any animal that breathed, said, "Prove it, then, if you're still half the man you were." That Magnus had taken a coil of rope and walked out to the pen to be for 1 more hour the man he used to be before a fat widow from Ohio shamed him with her patience. To go at the horse the old way, the hard way, the only way any man had ever taught him. And now he was on this ground with 600 pounds of remembered agony churning between him and every exit out of that pen. The men were at the rails, 3 of them, 4, the rest still pounding up from across the yard. She heard their voices crashing over each other. "Somebody get a rifle." "Magnus, don't move, for God's sake, don't move. God Almighty." And under all of it, steady as a drum beat, the horse screaming. She heard Calder behind her. "Verity, don't." She looked at the gate, at the horse, at Magnus Thorne, who had found just enough air to lift his head, and whose face, when she saw it, was not angry and not drunk anymore, but afraid. Completely nakedly, bottomlessly afraid. The face of a man who has finally met the exact end he has spent his whole life pretending he did not fear. She had seen that face before. In a mirror. On the worst mornings of the worst years of her marriage. She put her hand on the cold iron of the gate latch. "Get a rifle," Magnus choked out from the dirt. "Just get a—" "Nobody shoots," she said, loud enough to carry the length of the rail. "Nobody moves. Nobody fires a gun." Verity. Calder's voice right at her shoulder, now very low, and held very tight. "This is not the street in January. He's cornered, and he's terrified, and a cornered, terrified animal is the most dangerous thing God ever made. He is not going to stop this time. You don't know that." "Verity, I know what he is," she said. "I know exactly what he is, better than I know almost anything." She opened the gate. She heard Calder make a sound low in his throat. She heard Eli somewhere at the rail say something that might have been a boy's prayer. She heard the whole crowd of them go to that particular stillness. Crowds go to when they have stopped expecting anything at all except one specific terrible outcome that they will be telling their grandchildren about. She walked into the pen. Black Verdict saw her. And everything changed, and nothing changed in the very same half-second. His head came up. His circling broke his attention, splitting and tearing between the man down in the dirt and the woman who had just come through the gate into his cornered terror. And she felt the full force of his fear hit her like a wall of weather, like the charged, heavy ringing air in the breathless moment before lightning strikes the ground. She did not run. She did not rush him. She moved the way she had been moving toward this horse for 2 weeks. Slow, steady. With that particular weight and deliberateness that was no longer any kind of strategy, but was simply her, the way she had always occupied a space when the whole world around her needed exactly one person in it to be perfectly unshakably still. "Hey," she said. His ears swiveled toward her. "Hey now, look at me. Just at me." He was still circling, tighter now, but still wound far past the place where any thought could reach him. She knew that place better than she knew her own name. She had lived inside it herself, the place out past, thinking where the body runs nothing but its single oldest program, the one that screams danger, 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 and will not hear one word of sense over the top of it, no matter who is speaking or how kindly. "You know me," she said, taking one slow step and stopping. One step and stopping. You know my hands. You know my voice in the cold. Come back now. Come on back to me. Magnus, on the ground between them, had gone absolutely still. At last collapsed onto his side, one arm thrown up over his head, doing the precisely right thing for the first time in his whole life in the presence of this horse. Doing nothing. Being nothing. A proud, hard man finally perfectly out of the way. Black Verdict's hooves struck the frozen ground twice more hard enough that she felt the shock of it come up through the soles of her boots and into her teeth. She stopped 6 feet from him, and she dropped her eyes. The silence was enormous. She could hear her own heart slamming against her ribs. She could hear Magnus breathing in the dirt. She could hear the held breath of 24 men along the rails, and the wind coming down off the white mountains, and the great ragged bellows of the horse just beginning almost beneath hearing to change its rhythm. You do not have to become what they made you, she said. The words came out quiet. They were not for the rail or for the men, or for Magnus, or for Ransom Calder standing frozen at the open gate with his heart in his throat. They were for the horse and the horse alone. And she said them the way you say the very truest things, without any performance in them, without drama, without a single thing held back. Just directly, one wounded creature to another across 6 feet of frozen ground. You had something terrible done to you. I know that. But that is not who you are. That is only what happened to you. And those two things are not the same. They were never the same. Don't you let them tell you they were. Black Verdict trembled. It started deep in his flanks and rolled forward through his whole enormous body. A long, shuddering total, trembling, the kind that moves through a living animal when something it has been braced against every hour of every day for years on end, without rest, suddenly stops pressing. She had never seen a horse tremble like that in all her life. She had never seen anything alive tremble like that. It was too honest a thing to watch, and she made herself watch it anyway because he should not have to do it alone. His foreleg rose. She felt the collective flinch run down the whole length of the rail, felt it move through the air through 24 held breaths. And she did not flinch. And she did not step back, not so much as half an inch. She kept her eyes soft and her hands open and empty, and her whole body still as a fence post in the cold. The hoof came down beside her, not on her, beside her, close enough that she felt the impact travel up through the frozen ground, through the soles of her boots, up the length of her legs, and into the center of her chest. He lowered his head, and he pushed his nose against her shoulder, and she raised her hand, slow and certain, and laid her open palm flat against the broad bone of his jaw, and she said so quiet that only he and God could have heard it. There you are. For one long, impossible, suspended moment, the entire territory seemed to hold its breath along with her. Then she said, without turning around, without lifting her hand from his face, Magnus, get up. Move slow. Walk to the gate. Don't run. She heard him move, heard the scrape of his boots in the frozen dirt, the grunt and effort of a heavy man rising from the ground after a hard fall, the careful, measured, almost reverent steps of a man who has finally understood all the way down that this is not about him anymore and never truly was. She heard the gate open and close and the latch fall. She stayed another full minute with her hand on the horse's face, feeling the great trembling slowly leave him, feeling the warmth of him and the solid, impossible reality of him and the particular miracle of an animal choosing in the single most terrified moment of its entire life not to destroy. When she finally took her hand away and stepped back, he let her go. She walked to the gate. She let herself out. She latched it behind her with her hands that had at last stopped shaking. And she turned around to find a rail lined with silent men and one pale, gray-faced headman sitting in the dirt outside the pen with his back against a post and his knees drawn up to his chest and his hat pressed flat against his heart. And Ransom Calder standing at the gate exactly where she had left him, looking at her with an expression she had never once seen on his face before. She had seen careful. She had seen fair. She had seen the thing with weather in it. This was none of those. This was a man looking at something that had just walked clean through his entire understanding of what was possible in this world, and finding that he had no adequate words anywhere in him for it, and being moved beyond words enough not to mind the lack. "I told you," she said. "He isn't mean." Calder's voice, when he found it, was low and not entirely steady. "You walked into a pen with a horse that was about to kill a man. I knew he wouldn't. You couldn't have known that. No one on God's earth could have known that." "I knew," she said, "because I know what it looks like when a frightened thing decides at the very last second to choose mercy instead. I have been making that exact choice my whole life every morning I got up instead of giving in." She looked at him steadily. So has he. We recognized each other. That's all it ever was. Calder looked at her a long, long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Both of his hands closed around it the way a man takes hold of something he has very nearly lost forever, and held it fast, and she let him. And neither of them said one more word about it. Behind her, inside the pen, Black Verdict stood quiet at the rail. And Magnus Thorne, still sitting in the cold dirt with his back against the post, looked up at the horse through the timber rails for the first time in his life, without his hand reaching for anything to use against it. He looked for the first time anyone could remember, like a man who had finally set down a thing he had been carrying so long he had forgotten the weight of it. No one along that rail spoke for a long while. And in that silence, something on the Calder ranch ended for good, and something else quieter and far more durable began. That night, the ranch house was warm and lit and crowded, and Obadiah, who cooked when he was frightened and had been frightened half to death, had made enough food for 20 hungry men. The hands came in by ones and twos and filled the long table. Magnus came in last of all. He stood in the kitchen doorway a moment, tall and broken down and still gray, beneath the weather of his face, one hand pressed to his bound ribs. And he looked at the room and at the men at the table who had been his to command for 4 years, and at Verity standing at the stove. And he said to no one in particular, and to every soul in the room at once, "I owe this woman an apology, out loud, where you can all hear it." Nobody moved. A fork went down somewhere. "I have been trying to run her off this ranch since the hour she stepped down off that stagecoach," he said. "The talk, the cold shoulder, and the whip that was mine. I left it for the horse in the dark, and I left it for her to find, and I did it to break her spirit so she'd take Calder's money and go on back to wherever it was she came from." His voice was stripped clean of its usual hard authority, and what lay underneath it was not weakness. It was something far more uncomfortable for a man like him than weakness. It was honesty. "I was wrong about her. I was wrong about the horse. And I was wrong all my life about what it even means to be strong. I had it backwards." He looked at Verity directly across the warm, crowded room. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sloane. That's the whole of it. That's all I've got to give you." The kettle began to whistle on the stove. She lifted it from the heat and poured the steaming water into the waiting pot. And she let the silence in the room do what it needed to do. She was not a woman who rushed in to fill a hard silence for the comfort of the person who had finally earned the right to stand inside one. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Thorne. You've got 2 cracked ribs at the least, and you need hot tea more than you need to make speeches in doorways. There's a chair. Use it." Something in the whole room let go at once like a held breath, finally released. Eli made a sound that was very nearly a laugh and tried to hide it in his sleeve. Amos Reed reached across for the bread without ceremony. Pruitt pulled out the empty bench, and the men settled for the first time since the day she had arrived into something that felt simply plainly like supper among people who belonged at the same table. The storm came 4 days later, and it came without apology and without much warning. She had felt it building for 2 full days, a change in the very quality of the cold, the way the cattle were drifting and bunching in the far pasture, restless. A new restlessness in Black Verdict himself, who paced the north fence of his corral the way he had not paced since her first week. A pacing she had learned by now to read as something in the air rather than something in him. She said so at supper. "There's a big storm coming. 2 days off, maybe less than that." Magnus looked up from his plate. The old reflex to argue flickered and died in his eyes. "Sky's been clear as glass," he said. But it was not a challenge now. It was a question. "The cattle are bunching up against the far tree line," she said. "And Black Verdict's been walking that north fence since yesterday morning. He did the very same thing before the last hard, cold snap. The one that took down 40 feet of your fence line." Amos Reed turned it over slowly. "Air's got a smell to it, come to think," he said at last. "Like iron. Could be, she's right." "We'll move the herd down to the lower pasture first thing in the morning," Calder said, deciding. "And get the extra feed hauled into the barn before noon while we still can." It came that night, not the morning. That night, while they slept, the temperature fell 20 degrees inside an hour, and the wind came down off the mountains with the whole weight of geology behind it, something ancient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small works and plans of men. She woke to the sound of it at 2 in the morning and lay rigid in the dark and thought with a sinking certainty too soon. We didn't move them in time. She was up and dressed before the first boots hit the hallway floor. The cattle had spooked north in the dark. That was the first thing Calder said when he came into the kitchen, already in his heavy coat, already moving with the tight, compressed efficiency of a man who has stepped fully inside an emergency. They had drifted up onto the ridge before the hands could turn them, and the ridge trail would be murder in this. He was taking every man he had, and he needed her here. "I need someone on this place who can hold it together if we're gone longer than we mean to be," he said. "Someone Obadiah won't go to pieces around. Someone who knows where every bandage and every lantern and every sack of feed is kept. That's you. I need you here, Verity. Can you do that for me?" She understood exactly what he was asking and exactly why, and she hated it, the precise way you hate a necessary thing you cannot argue with. "Yes," she said. He put his hand against the side of her face, brief and warm and deliberate as everything he ever did. And then he turned and went out into the storm with his men. They did not come back at dawn. She told herself that was to be expected. The ridge was far in fair weather, and this was not fair weather. At 8 in the morning, she told herself it was fine. At 10. At noon, watching the white wall of the storm through the window, she told herself it was fine. At 2 in the afternoon, Eli Garrow came back alone. On foot. Half his young face was gone white with the cold, and the other half was the grey colour of old paper, and he was moving on pure will where his body had already quit. She had him inside and sat down by the fire before he had finished his second broken sentence. "The ridge trail gave out under us," he said. "Sheet ice under the new snow where you couldn't see it. Pruitt's horse went down hard. Pruitt's all right banged up, but all right. But then the wind came up into a full whiteout, and we couldn't see a hand in front of us, and we had to turn back or lose everybody." He swallowed hard. "Mr. Calder didn't make it back down with us, ma'am." Everything in her went very, very quiet. "He's alive," Eli said quickly, his voice cracking and reassembling itself. "He's alive. He got turned around in the white, and his horse spooked and threw him, and he went down into a gully about halfway up the ridge. There's a rock overhang keeping the worst of the snow off him, and Magnus is down there with him right now, won't leave him. But he's hurt bad, Mrs. Sloane. His leg, maybe his ribs from the fall. He can't walk out of there on his own. We tried to bring a horse up from the line shack to carry him, but the trail past the creek is solid ice now, and not one of our horses will set a hoof on it. They won't go. They can't." They were both in that instant thinking the very thing. She stood up. "Stay here," she told the boy. "Get warm by the fire. Tell Obadiah to keep feeding it and keep you in it. You did right, Eli. You did exactly right coming for me." She went to the barn. Black Verdict heard her coming from clear across the howling yard. She knew because she heard him answer, not the scream, not the panic, but the low sound. The question sound. The very same one he had made on the first grey morning she had ever come through his gate a lifetime ago in January. She unlatched the gate and went in, and he came to her directly. No spiral, no testing of the space between them. Straight to her through the wind. She put both her hands flat against his great face and looked up into his dark eye. "I need to ask you something," she said. The wind hammered the barn wall like a fist. The cold was a living hunting presence. Her hands were shaking inside her gloves, and not from the cold, or not only from the cold. "I know what it is to carry more weight than people ever think a body can bear," she said. "You know it too. We've both of us been carrying it our whole lives every single day, and look, we are both still standing here." She pressed her forehead gently against the broad bone of his nose. "I need you to carry me tonight. Just tonight. Out into that. And I promise you on everything I have left you can choose. Same as you have always been able to choose with me. I am not taking one thing from you that you don't give. I am only asking. And if you say no, I'll find another way." The wind struck the wall again and again. Black Verdict stood absolutely still. And then he did a thing she had never once seen him do and never in her life expected to see. He lowered himself. Not all the way to the ground, not the trained broken kneel of a circus animal responding to a cracked command. Just enough. A bending of his great front legs, a lowering of his enormous front end, and a tilting of his weight that offered her his own height. That said as plainly and as clearly as anything a living animal has ever said to a human soul, "I heard you. And I choose this. Get on." Her throat closed completely. She mounted. She did not give herself a single second to think about it. She had learned long ago that thinking was the great enemy of the things that have to be done on faith alone. She put her boot in the stirrup, and she rose up, and she settled her full weight across his broad back, and she felt him take it. Feel it. Test it. And decide deliberately to keep holding it. "Thank you," she said. So quiet it was barely a word at all in all that wind, and she rode out into the storm. The cold was a wholly different animal on horseback in a blizzard than it had ever been on the ground. It found every gap in her coat, the bare strip of skin between her collar and her hat, and it went into those places, and it stayed, and it bit down. She fixed her whole mind hard on the horse beneath her, the furnace heat of him, the sure rolling movement of him, the way he read the treacherous ground through ice and snow with the deep intelligence of an animal who had already survived terrain that had defeated trained mounts and broken hard men. She gave him his head. She trusted his hooves over her own eyes. The road to the frost place ran south away before it curved east, keeping them just barely below the worst of the ridge ice. But at the curve, the wind came howling in sideways off the open flat. And for a full half-minute, she could see nothing at all. No road, no sky, no mountains, not even the black neck of the horse beneath her, only roaring white in every direction. She did not pull back on the reins in her fear. She bent low over his neck and pressed her face into his mane and said into the storm, "You know where the ground is. I don't. I trust you. Take us there." And she felt him lean his great shoulder into the wind and keep going straight and sure, as though he had been waiting his whole hard life for someone to finally let him. Cordelia Frost's house had warm light burning in every single window when it finally swam up out of the white, and that light was the most beautiful thing Verity Sloane had seen since she had left Ohio. She was off the horse and pounding at the door in seconds. And when Cordelia Frost opened it and saw her standing there caked in snow, half her face gone white with frost, holding the reins of an enormous black horse in the teeth of a blizzard, she did not ask one single wasted question. She turned on her heel and called her husband's name in a voice that moved through that whole house like a struck bell. "Calder's on the North Ridge," Verity said through cracked lips. "East Gully halfway up the trail. Magnus Thorne is down there with him. He's hurt his leg, maybe his ribs, and he can't walk out, and our horses won't take the ice." Cordelia was already moving, already shouting orders down the hall. "Walter, get the men up. All of them, get the sled hitched and the Eastern Trail horses, the ones that know the low road." It took 12 minutes. 12 minutes, and the frontier machinery of neighbors helping neighbors that had kept people alive in that hard country for 50 years. 4 frost hands bundled and grim. A sturdy sled. 2 horses that knew the eastern approach the way other horses knew the way back to their own barn. Cordelia Frost pressed a flask of something hot and medicinal into Verity's frozen hands and folded her fingers around it. You'll ride back in the sled where it's safe, Cordelia said. Let the hands lead the way up. You've done your part and more. I'm riding. You're half frozen through Verity. You'll be no use to him dead. He rode out into the storm for those cattle to keep this ranch alive through the winter, she said. I am not going to sit at your kitchen table drinking tea while other men go and bring him home. She pulled her collar up against her chin. I'll be fine. Black Verdict will see to that. He has so far. Cordelia Frost turned and looked for a long moment at the great black horse, standing patient and unmoving in the howling dark of the yard, his head up, his eyes clear and steady, waiting. That horse, she said slowly. That's the one they all say is the killer. The one that... Yes, Verity said. That horse. Cordelia looked back at her with the expression of a woman who has been quietly recalibrating her understanding of the world for some weeks now, and has just in this doorway finally landed somewhere new and is making her peace with it. Then get on, she said, and get your husband home. They rode back up into the storm together. Calder was conscious. That was the first and best thing Magnus Thorne said when the rescue reached the lip of the gully, conscious and dangerously cold and furious at himself in the specific helpless way of a man who has built his whole life around competence and been laid flat by a sheet of ice. I told you to stay at the ranch, he said when he heard her voice come down to him over the wind. There was no anger in it, only wonder and cold. You did, she said already down in the gully beside him, her hands moving over his face and his throat checking what she knew to check from years of nursing a difficult man through hard Ohio winters. His color was bad, but not the worst. His leg was wrong, the knee she judged not the hip from the unnatural angle of it. Ribs likely cracked from the shallow way he was breathing against the pain. I meant it too, she said. I know you meant it. She sat back on her heels in the snow. Frost's sled is 20 feet up that slope. We are going to get you onto it, and we are going to take you home, and I am going to set that knee by the fire. The cattle can fend for themselves until morning. You cannot. Hush now. He looked up at her, and his face in the gray stormlight was pain and cold and something deep and specific and overwhelming all at once. Verity, I need to say, not now, she said gently. Save it for when you're warm and dry and I can actually hear you over this wind. We are both going to be there for the saying of it. I promised you that, and I keep my promises. Ask the horse. He closed his eyes a moment against the cold, and then he opened them, and he asked the only question that mattered. How did you get up here? How in God's name did you get to the Frosts in this? She glanced up just once briefly to the lip of the gully, to where Black Verdict stood against all that roaring white, patient and dark and utterly unbothered by the storm. The youngest Frost hand holding his reins as loosely as he could manage, because the boy had learned within the first minute that loose was the only way the great black horse would suffer to be held at all. I asked him, she said, and he said yes. They got Ransom Calder up the slope and onto the sled wrapped in every blanket the Frosts had sent, and they brought him down off that killing ridge through the slackening storm. And Magnus Thorne walked the whole way beside the sled, with one hand on the rail of it, bearing his share of the weight at every rough patch, careful and quiet, and complaining of nothing. A hard, proud man doing penance in the only honest language he had ever known how to speak. The ranch house was warm and lit and crowded with worried men by the time they brought him through the door. She worked on his knee for 2 solid hours by the lamplight, and it was bad, but it was not the permanent kind of bad. It was the kind that mends with time and stillness and a stubborn refusal to be reckless on it again too soon. She told him exactly that in the flat clinical voice she kept for the most serious things, and he listened the way he listened to everything serious. Completely. Without one word of argument, without the wounded male performance of being fine. The ribs were cracked, not broken clean through. She had bound worse on worse men in worse winters. By midnight, the storm had begun to ease its grip. By 3 in the morning, the house had gone quiet, most of the hands sent off to their bunks. Obadiah finally talked into sleeping. Eli passed out cold at the kitchen table with a quilt she had laid over his thin shoulders. She sat beside Calder in the low lamplight, his wrapped knee raised on a folded blanket. His bound ribs rising and falling slow, and even his color come back at last into his face. "Silas Mercer's not going to stop," he said into the quiet. "I know. He'll scrape up the money somewhere and he'll come anyway. Men like that always find the money for spite. I know that too." "Are you afraid of him?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about all things. "No," she said at last. "I was afraid when I got on that stagecoach in Ohio with everything I owned in one bag. I was afraid when I stepped down into that street in January and heard them laugh. I was afraid every single morning I walked out to that corral, and every time I went through Black Verdict's gate, and most of all tonight, riding into that white nothing." She looked at him steadily in the lamplight. "I have been afraid of nearly every single thing in my life that ever turned out to matter. But being afraid and being stopped are two entirely different things, Ransom, and I quit confusing the one for the other a long, long time ago." Silas Mercer came 11 days later, while the snow still lay deep in the yard, and the hard cold had not yet loosened its grip on the land, with a young, uncomfortable lawyer named Garrett Pike riding behind him and a sheaf of papers in his saddlebag that he plainly believed would frighten the fat widow straight back into being small and grateful and gone. He had not counted on the men. He found Verity in the yard in the cold near the corral, and he did to her exactly what men like him always did. He spoke past her, over the top of her, directly at her husband, as though the woman in question were a parcel of disputed property to be haggled over between gentlemen. He spoke of debts and of irregularly executed wills and of the territorial court and of how very costly and very slow such proceedings could become for everyone involved. "Costly for who exactly?" Calder asked from the porch chair where he sat with his bound knee stretched out before him, unable to stand, but entirely unbowed. "There is no surviving male heir with a claim on anything. The farm was Thomas Mercer's free and clear, and he left it to his wife in a will my own counsel has already read front to back. You are spending your client's money to be told that by a judge in Billings, Mr. Pike. He's welcome to it. My lawyer is Lawrence Stone. Every further word in this matter goes through him. But in the end, it was not Ransom Calder who finished it. It was Verity. Stepping down off the porch into the frozen mud of the yard on her own, 2 feet, with the entire crew of the Calder ranch gathered silent at her back. Magnus Thorne at the front of them, arms folded across his broad chest, his twice-broken face set as hard and immovable as the mountain standing behind the house. "There's something my brother-in-law is hoping you'll never think to ask him, Mr. Pike," she said, and her voice carried clear across that yard, the way it had once carried across a corral to a frightened animal. "So I'll ask it for you in front of witnesses. Ask him how Thomas's debts came to be in the first place. Ask him whose name is truly written down beside them. Ask him about the money he borrowed against his own dying brother's farm, and which of the 2 Mercer brothers actually spent it on whiskey and bad cards in town." She let it land in the cold air, and she watched it land on the lawyer. "I sold that farm to pay what Thomas owed. And the greater part of what Thomas owed, he owed to creditors that this man standing here brought to his brother's door. I have the papers that prove it. Lawrence Stone holds the copies sealed. And there are 8 grown men standing in this yard with me who will swear before any judge in this territory that they heard your client in the Stone Creek Saloon 2 weeks gone offer hard money to any man who'd run me off this land." The yard went silent, but for the wind in the eaves. Garrett Pike turned and looked for a long moment at his client. And whatever it was, he read in Silas Mercer's face right then the particular ashen hollow gray of a man who has just watched the whole of his leverage catch fire and burn down to the post in front of a crowd. It was enough and more than enough. The young lawyer gathered up his reins without another word to anyone. "I believe," he said very carefully to the cold air between them, "that my client and I have urgent business back in Billings." Silas Mercer looked across the yard at Verity, and she held his gaze without flinching, the way she had learned over 32 long years to hold the gaze of every man who had ever tried to make her small. Not with anger, Not with pleading, not with any of the old shrinking, but with the plain, unhurried, immovable steadiness of a woman who has finally completely stopped being afraid of him. She saw all the way through him to the small, frightened thing that ran his whole life, and she let him see in her face that she did. "You came a very long way," she said, "to find out that I'm not small anymore. I'm sorry it cost you the trip." He had no answer for that. There was none to be had. He wheeled his horse around in the frozen yard and rode out the way he had come, the lawyer trailing behind him, and that was the very last that Stone Creek Bend or Verity Sloan ever saw of Silas Mercer. Spring came to the territory, the way it always came to that high country. Not gradually, the way it crept into Ohio, but all at once, overnight and definitive. The deep snow gave up without ceremony. The mud came, and then the first green came pushing up through the mud. The cattle moved back up to the north pasture. The days stretched long and gold, and the whole hard land seemed to let out a breath it had been holding since October. Magnus Thorne gave his notice in April. She had felt it coming for some weeks, and not because things had gone bad between them, but because they had gone good, and he was a man who understood that the ending of a long war sometimes leaves a soldier needing wholly new ground to stand on. He was going to ride for a brother's spread down in Wyoming, where nobody knew the man he used to be. He came to find her at the corral, the morning he left his bedroll already lashed behind his saddle. "What you did here," he said, and stopped and started over because the words came hard to him and always would. "I'm a better hand than I was the day you got off that coach. A better man, I think, though it took me near losing my life to a horse to see it. I didn't expect any of that. I sure didn't want it at the start." He looked at her. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. The beginning of it. You said all that already the night of the storm, in front of everyone. Worth a man saying twice. Some things are." "You're going to be all right, Magnus Thorne," she said. "You're far too stubborn to be anything else." He almost smiled, that same near smile his old employer had, she'd noticed. Perhaps it was a thing the country taught its men. "So are you, Mrs. Sloane, stubborn as winter." He settled his hat and touched the brim of it to her and swung up into his saddle and rode out south. And she watched him go until he was a small dark shape against the green and felt something old and tight finally settle and go quiet in her chest. Calder's knee mended slower than either of them had the patience for. She bullied him into resting it, and he submitted to being bullied with the rare grace of a man who has decided all the way down to trust the person doing the bullying. By April, he was walking with a cane and a curse. By May, he had thrown the cane in the corner. The day he rode out beside her across the north pasture, the first true ride for either of them since the night of the storm, the two of them ahorse in the long May sun with the mountains standing white and enormous and unbothered above them all. She thought about Ohio, about the kitchen table and the letter she had read 3 times in the lamplight, about every single thing she had been afraid she was, and every cruel thing she had been told she was across 32 years. And the long, long distance between all of that and this. Black verdict moved beneath her steady and powerful and sure carrying her weight, the way he carried everything she asked of him now by his own choice, by hard-won trust, by the slow-built certainty of a creature who had finally learned after a lifetime of evidence to the contrary that this one particular pair of hands would never ever betray him. "You're thinking," Calder said, riding easy beside her. "I always am. You knew that when you married me. What about?" She looked out at the mountains. She felt the warm sun on her face and the great living animal moving beneath her and the solid, specific, hard-won reality of a life she had built with her own 2 hands out of the only things she had ever flatly refused to surrender: her stubbornness, her patience, her bone-deep willingness to plant her feet in the middle of the road when every voice she had ever known was screaming at her to run. "About how wrong they all were," she said. "Every last one of them. Every soul who ever looked at me and decided I was too much." Calder looked over at her. "They were wrong," she said. "All of them. About all of it." He nodded once. Slow, certain. "Yes," he said. "They were." And that spring and every spring that came after it, the people of Stone Creek Bend would tell the story differently than they had told it that first cold January. Not the story of the heavy widow who had stepped down off a stagecoach to be laughed at in the street, but the story of the woman who stood her ground in the road when not one other soul in town would, who walked into a pen that grown men would not enter to save the life of a man who had wronged her, who rode a horse that could not be ridden through a blizzard that had stopped every other living thing on the mountain when the road was sheet ice, and the only thing standing between a good man and a frozen death was one strong woman who had never, not once in her whole hard life, agreed to make herself less than she was. They had called her too much woman for any man to want, too heavy for a saddle, too soft for the frontier, too big for a life that was supposed to be lived small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps it was handed. And it was that very fullness of body of mercy, of a stubbornness that had outlasted every hard winter the world had ever thrown against it, that in the end had saved them all. She turned her face back toward the mountains, and she rode.